Namaste. Welcome to my house. Welcome to my heart. I really like what you're doing. Don't consider yourself a rank amateur. We're all beginners at something, but then when we learn a little something, we are no longer beginners, right? In your letter, you said that you were in the position of receiving and that I was the teacher. Personally, I don't like father-son relationships and teaching situations. I consider myself as a teacher to try to remember as hard as I can what it's like to be a student. And teachers who forget what it's like to be on the other side of that information coming at them sometimes are not very effective at getting a point across. I have met many, many teachers in my life that just regurgitate the same stuff, or they've been doing it for so long it just becomes very, very pat. And I feel that if I am interacting with a person, there's a part of me that has to put myself in your eyes, looking at me, trying to find out what it was like for me when I first learned that concept. And I'll tell you, nothing is easy. Nothing is easy. Even with innate talent, which tends to make people lazy, people who dig ditches, people who are persistent, people who doubt everything and ask questions constantly, people who dig in and study, those are the people that deserve the rewards that they get. So I tend to think of myself in those terms. I think of myself as dealing with a colleague, seeing you and I eyeball to eyeball. And my job as a teacher is to get you like a bird to grow up and fly away from the nest as quick as possible, and hopefully you will come back as my competition. If not, I haven't done my job very well. I'd like to go through the letters a little bit, otherwise I could be here talking about music. I could talk until the sun burns out. First thing, the pronunciation of your name. If you could, on a video in the future, pronounce it slowly a few times for me. I have a hard time with new names. I'm not as egotistical as I might look and seem. I'm not attached to egos, and so I tend to forget names. I think more about conversations and things, experiences that I've had with people, faces I recognize, but names, and ego attachments, vanities, I don't do terribly well with that, I'm sorry. I will have to repeat your name and mispronunciate it several times until I get it right. So if you could remind me from time to time slowly, I would so appreciate that. Thank you. Let's get right on with what we're talking about here, music. First of all, let me look at your first letter here. In the first letter, we were talking about David Bruce. Yes, your guru. Baba Chi calls himself now. Yes, I think I remember him. I went to the Ali Akbar Khan school and hung around there, especially around the time in the 70s when they created the new cafeteria. I mean, I've been hanging out there since the 60s, late 60s, 66, I think, is when I first came to San Francisco. I first met Ali Akbar Khan in 67, hung around with a drummer who was part of a group called Shanti back then. It was the most, pardon my language, the most ass-kicking rock and roll East Indian group I'd ever heard since the Mahavishnu Orchestra. Brilliant people. Hot fingers on tabla. The drummer, very good friend of mine, and I helped him develop a thing called the Cosmic Beam. I had a friend, Sandra Slade, who plays drums and is a drum teacher here in San Francisco. She hung up and graduated from the school. I think she spent 5 or 6 years there. And the first time I went to visit her in her dorm room there, they just built new dorms and a new cafeteria, so I went to try out the food. She introduced me to a guy named David Bruce. I don't know if his last name was Hughes. Hughes, but I believe he was a silver flute. He played flute at that particular time, and I met him, and and then we ate some food in the cafeteria, but I didn't get a chance to formally get to know him, didn't hang out with him, but I do remember him saying something to me that made an impression, and that was he wanted to know why music had the emotional impression, and that no one in all of his years of being a jazz flutist, I guess he was a jazz flautist, in all the years he'd played jazz flute, he had never met a single musician who could explain why music did what it did. And that was a good question, because at that particular time, that's exactly how I felt and exactly what I was working on. Fortunately, it was just a few years later that I had an opportunity to figure it out. It was in a strict study of physics and the laws of physics and how physics gives rise to the nature of sound and how sound in specific gives rise to music theory. Something that most physicists and scientists that I talk to know little or nothing about. And even though music and sound is taught in physics classes, the actual application of all this physics and these formulas is not applied to music theory quantitatively and in terms of analysis. And vice versa in music. I've met a lot of musicians who are amateur physicists or scientists, and they learn music theory by the ABC system the way everybody else does, and do a lot of rote memorization of music. But they don't question the very nature of it. They don't question get to the deeper levels of it, and so never tried to connect the scientific reasoning behind the nature of music to music theory. So the theorists who know a little bit about science don't bring the science over, and the scientists who know a lot about the science and a little bit about music theory don't combine the music theory. So I realized for me, that was where I wanted to go. Since that was the great mystery, I jumped in with both feet. It took me a few years to figure it out, but I did. In the Western tradition that we use, which has 12 chromatic tones and an equal tempered scale, there are 13 intervals. Those 13 intervals have 13 levels of tension. Exactly how those levels of tension happen is science. How they affect us is psychology. And I understand the connection between the two now, and that could be further videos. I could spend hours just talking about that. I'm not familiar with David's research. It's nice to know that he finally figured out the science behind the emotional content of music. And I'd be interested in reading his papers. Maybe we agree, maybe we don't agree. I can only assume that if he's into East Indian religion and has been a Krishna who has been thinking for years, he must go back to the original Indian teachings and find there in the Holy Scriptures, of course, mention of music and its intervals. And in there, of course, you have to do a very deep, in-depth study of those great scriptures to begin to understand all this. But the connections are there. The understanding of the great Indian masters was incredible in terms of what they knew about the nature of sound and the psychological connection that we have to it. I always like to tell people that the universe was created in an idea, a single thought, a notion. That notion invented a thing called architecture, and architecture had two children, music and dance, and the rest is academic. To get to your other questions here, let's see. Yes, I am a 60s hippie. I'm a prototype of the 60s hippie. The Mr. Natural character is actually based on me. I think I look just like myself, and I think you can tell that. I hope you can tell that. Robert Crumb, of course, was the artist that did that character. I was working at a place called Ripoff Press and at a place called Good Times Graphics at the time. And at Good Times Graphics, I was doing camera work. I was taking the artwork that the artists were producing, and I was creating photographic films and what we call stats, and then corrected those stats on light tables with a pen to erase get rid of all the imperfections, and then those stats would be used to blow the copper plate that went on the press that created the comics. So acting as a middle or go-between the printer and the artists, I learned a lot about, again, art and technology, and people just started calling me by the character's name, Natural or Mr. Natural. And in 1972, I believe, 1972, 1973, I actually went to the DMV here in San Francisco and had my name officially changed to Mr. Natural. I then got a hold of an attorney named Terrence Hallinan at that time, and paid him money to have my name officially changed to Mr. Natural, and I've been the one and only real Mr. Natural ever since that time. So yeah, if people read the comic book, they know who I am. If people read the comics, they'll know that in the 60s I was in the guru business and was a spiritual leader and a teacher back then, but mostly dealt with Zen, mostly into the Asian or Japanese forms of enlightenment and Western tradition of enlightenment. I was not deeply steeped in any of the East Indian religions until much, much later on in the late 70s and early 80s. I became more and more familiar with that. Was I here during the Hare Krishna temple? Yes, as a matter of fact. The Hare Krishna temple was over there on 21st or something in Valencia Street, and I remember it used to be a funeral parlor. And as the Krishna movement began to grow in here, I believe it was around the time that the Beatles were just getting into Maharishi Mahesh Yoga, I believe, and Transcendental Meditation. And around that time, the Krishnas here finally got enough money together that they went, that funeral parlor, basically, people moved out, and they moved in. And I remember the most delightful thing I liked about the funeral parlor is when I went back by there all the time in the past, it was so gray and so dark and black and brown and maudlin. The Krishnas came in there and they stripped all of the paint off of the wood and restored the wood to its beautiful, pristine, and then painted the entire outside a Pepto-Bismol pink, which is just delightful. The ashram just glowed in the dark, and you could see it from blocks and blocks away. And then, of course, wearing the yellow and orange robes back in those days, coming in and out of the Pink Palace, was a very colorful affair. Most of the Krishnas would march up and down Haight Street, and I'd be on Haight and Ashbury preaching my truths, doing my little guru thing, and they'd be marching up and down the street. And I became fairly well acquainted with a few of the people in the movement here. A couple of my friends dropped out and dropped into the Krishna movement. So I do remember it quite well. I remember the temple quite well, and had a few dearest friends of mine go into the movement back then. I also knew many other gurus. Guru Maharaji Ji, who is still wearing a suit and out there teaching now, Prima, and Maharishi Mahesh Yoga, Anton LaVey, who was the head of the Satan Church. I knew there was the Voodoo Church here. There was the Psychedelic Venus Church. Jefferson Fuck Poland was a good friend of mine. The transgenders had their own religion that they were starting at that time. It was quite a time in the 60s, early 70s, because lots of religions were being invented. The Foundations of Revelations with Father, who I also worked with for a while up until his death. Bhagwan, Baba Ram Das. I can't even remember all the names. It's been almost a half a century, you realize, and a lot of time sand has gone between now and then. Looking further down your thing here and moving on. rank amateur, blah, blah, blah. You're exploring, okay, music. Yes, you haven't found that one instrument yet. My suggestion is play them all. Play as many as you can, and what will happen is one of them will get attached to you, and you'll become attached to it. One of the things I've learned about playing a musical instrument in general is there's a lot of soul. There's a lot of information in the flute. There's a lot of information in the violin. And when you play that and you give over a part of yourself to that, it becomes magnetized with your essence. That flute, that violin actually takes on a part of your soul, a part of your information, a part of your consciousness, becomes a part of that instrument, and vice versa. In order to really learn how to play it, you have to open yourself up to it. You have to allow it to sing. You have to get your ego out of the way and allow the instrument to teach you how it sings. Every instrument that was created wants to sing. That's its purpose. And we people kind of put our hands on it and try to force something upon that. It happens with the piano. Well, most of my students that come in here, they sit down and they think it's typing, and they just try to type away at the keyboard. It's the worst. I try to get people to push a single note and listen carefully, and to listen to the overtone series, and to play a chord, and to listen to the wobbles and the warbles and the tension that's happening within the chord, and then realize that it's breathing. And if they can hear the breathing, and if they can get their breathing synchronized with that of the instrument, and then start playing a melody, then the whole thing comes alive. It's the difference between a metronomic playing and what I call finding a groove. A lot of people can count 1, 2, 3, 4, or have a metronome go tick-tock, tick-tock, and play along with it. That's one level of skill, and it's a necessary level of skill. But once the pulse has gone across the heart, once the shock wave has gone across the heart, the beat, blood is forced through the body, and that blood creates a pressure within the body, which we call the pulse, and that pulse is the life force itself flowing through the body. And unless we learn how to put that into the instrument and to have the instrument respond and come back, then the playing is non-emotional. There's a sociopathic intellectual disconnect between you and the instrument. So what happens is eventually you learn the instrument learns you, and you develop a friendship, and that friendship grows. And you might develop a friendship with one instrument, you might develop a friendship with many instruments. Back in the 60s, if you could learn to play a flute and become very good at being a flute player, that was good enough. But as time has gone on, more and more people are becoming more Renaissance-oriented, more versatile. Music theory is becoming simplified to the point now that it can be applicable to multiple instruments. I myself have learned to play in just the last 10 years 41 different musical instruments. I've learned to play every instrument in the orchestra, and many, many ethnic instruments like the didgeridoo and the oud and the ocarinas and and balalaikas and bouzouki and folk instruments, juns and kotos and sakahashis and takahashis and instruments and horns from all over the world. And I've become very, very, very interested in world music. My ear has gotten to the point where I accept any sound as being a musical possibility. And so I'm interested in all of it. And I use this music theory that I learned to teach myself how to conquer and play all of those various instruments. And I've developed a very personal relationship with many. Most of my students come in here and want to just learn how to play the piano. And after a very short period of time, a year or so, they find themselves playing guitar and picking up a flute and then tutoring on a trumpet. And there are basically 5 types of instruments: brass, woodwinds, keyboards, strings of many sorts, and percussion. And once you learn one of each of those and got those 5 basic food groups down, you then can learn, for instance, from learning to play a flute, you can learn to play a saxophone, a clarinet, an oboe, a bassoon, etc., etc. From playing the trumpet, you can learn to play a trombone, a tuba, a baritone, a French horn, etc., etc. The family of instruments begins to grow as you become familiar with the way that family works. So horns work one way, woodwinds tend to work another way, keyboards tend to be very much like percussion, strings come in either fifths or fourths. Fourths are the tuning on guitars, fifths are the tunings on mandolins and violins, cellos, for instance. And once you get used to those various tuning systems and those methods, then the number of instruments that you can play in that genre increase manyfold. I don't think there's anyone today who doesn't want to learn to play 5 or 6 musical instruments, and I think that's a good thing. I hope more people do that more often. Musical notation. Well, just keep looking at my site. The way to understand musical notation is there is a one universal way of understanding everything in music. Distance. It's all about distance. My eye sees a distance. My ear hears a distance. My hand has to move a distance. I have to think in terms of distances, and if I can get all of those ideas of distance together, speaking the same language, then the 4 or 5 different senses that I use in order to perform music begin to short circuit. You develop what's called synesthesia, and you get to the point where when I look at music now, I hear it in my head, or if I hear a song floating through the air, suddenly I hear the intervals, or if I get a thought in my mind about music, I can hear the intervals. When I look at the page, I can see the distance, and my hand automatically reaches for it on the keyboard now. And since all of them, these various senses, are speaking one universal language, they all short circuit, and it becomes, and the right brain and left brain work together, and it becomes a whole brain process. And all this boils down to distance and proportions. And it's very mathematically very simple. The ABC system, the pa, ra, da, gamma, the do, re, mi, fa, sos, these are mnemonic systems that work, that help you get started, but unfortunately they're languages that are basically dead languages now. Do, re, mi, fa, sol, la, ti is Latin. There's not very many people that speak that anymore. The system that you're using is basically an ancient East Indian language, and also comes from the Arabic. The ABCDEFG was developed by a monk called Otto Klugny in 900 AD. These systems were based on Euclid geometry, so he could publish books and explain music to people in published material. So these methods were not meant to tell us anything about the nature of music itself. They were just mnemonic devices to get started learning to read and write music, or learning to read music, really. They're not even really good for writing music. The ABC system is an absolute or a fixed system, a sort of a Newtonian point of view in which there's a fixed point in the entire universe evolves around it, where the do-re-mi system and the system that you're using is what we call a relative system, a movable do system. The solfege system is a much better system for learning to train the ear to hear and, as you said, transpose the music into another key. You can hear it in one key and transpose it instantly into another key. I can read music in one key and play it in another key on any musical instrument I want, in any key I want to play it in. Most people find that impossible to do. A pianist would have to look at the music, grab a pencil and paper, and sit down and re-notate the entire score to be able to play it in another key. People who study Broadway music in school do learn to play simple Broadway tunes in multiple keys because they're dealing with singers. who come in many bandwidths and shapes and sizes. But you don't find that discipline in all of music, and yet the possibility for it is there. So please keep coming to my website and watch as I teach how to do the 1, 2, 3 system. I use 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7 because it is the first thing that every child learns in language. We learn to count from 1 to 10, then we learn to count backwards from 10 to 1, reading music going up the staff, we're counting forward, reading music coming down the staff, we're reading backwards. The ABC system doesn't work because people don't learn the alphabet backwards. Who says G, F, E, D, C, B, A? And you have to be able to read a GFCA that fast in order to come down the scale. So unless you practice the scale backwards or practice the Twinkle, Twinkle, Little Star, A, B, C, D, E, F, G, unless you go G, F, E, D, C, B, A, you won't get it. But 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7 in any language and whatever your innate language is. If you are Indian and you speak Indian, please say the numbers in that. If you're French, say the numbers in French. If you're Spanish, and say uno, dos, tres. Or if you're, Greek, alpha, beta, gamma. Whatever language you speak that you learn to count in, you already have this linguistic advantage to being able to understand that. You can see and seek patterns in that with that language and begin to perceive the very nature, the underpinnings of the way in which music functions and works. It's not about naming names. It's not about this nominative process. It's more about verbs, its shapes, and the way in which things interact with each other. And instead of memorizing the 17 spellings of the scale, for instance, I recommend that people learn one formula that can generate the whole thing. I mean, you can memorize the times tables from 1 to 12. It takes about 2 years, 4th, 5th, and 6th grade to do that. But if I told you that there was one formula that you could put on any computer that would generate that times table, and you can learn to use that formula in 5 minutes, that's the way to go. So that's what I'm doing here, is I'm trying to generate knowledge based on the formulas. At the moment, I'm going to take a break, and I will start another video and be right back. Peace.